Going to click record. All right, I just started recording. I'm going over here. We have Kronkar, right? Kronkar?
Yes.
We have Kronkar. He's a member of Sword UCI. I am a member of Sword UCI. My name is Karps. Today I'll be talking to you about, well, the course itself is going to be titled Versus Sword and Board. And that's basically the principle here. It's how to understand a sword and boarder and how to beat them. But what's super cool about figuring out how to beat someone who's specifically sword and board is a lot of this stuff we'll talk about disadvantages and their advantages, which means when you want to do sword and board, you'll be aware of these things and know what to look out for. That way you can also be a better sword and boarder. I'm pulling up my notes right now. And I'm talking from the top here. Okay, so first of all, I want to preface this as a personal philosophy of mine and something just to note. This isn't the answer, you're right? There's not really an answer, because if there was a final answer on how to do this 100% right, everybody would be doing it. Does that make sense? That's the beauty of it. There's 1,000,001 ways to swing a sword, but only one has to ever really land. And that's the question. So, and even then, the most effective way of fighting isn't necessarily the best way of fighting. Ultimately, it's whatever you find promotes the maximum level of fun for you. For a lot of people, the maximum level of fun is winning, especially in a competitive sport. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is a very effective way to do sword and board or fight against sword and board. We all good? We're on the same page here? Sweet. So, Karps, why do you want to learn how to fight a sword and boarder? Well, guess what? If you've noticed, especially true in our region of Southern California, it's 99%, well, maybe not 99, but 90% sword and shield users. Likely, you won't go to a practice without fighting somebody who's using a sword and shield.
I think in our region, if literally everyone other than me that I know of uses sword and board, and 90% of them main it.
Yeah, that's the thing. A sword and board is a very established in our area a meta, and it's something that you can fight one-on-one and be effective. It's something you can fight, on a team and be effective. There's a lot to it, and the thing is being able to understand how to fight it is going to really take you pretty far in a climate that it is just incredibly popular. Now, let's talk about other regions. Is there other regions where people don't just do sword and board? Yeah, it totally is. If you go to events, east of us, because we're on the West Coast in Southern California, there's going to be a lot more weapon types that you'll see in larger field battles that are going to be archery or spear, reds. You're going to see Florentine in some cases. And you even see Florentine here. I personally love fighting Florentine. But today we're going to be talking about how to fight sword boarders. Oh, okay. So here's another question. I'm asking me some questions, all right? Because I like answering your questions. I also like asking questions. Karps, I fight sword and boarders all the time because they're 99% of my practice. I know how to fight them. What's the difference? Oh, no. What's the difference between them? They're all the same, right? I fought one sword and boarder. Oh, I can fight the next sword and boarder. Oh, as a note to everybody, there might be people trickling in because this is a live class. Anytime that there's somebody who's going to be trickling in, I'll do just a very, very brief thing and stop. It probably won't happen very often, but just as a note. So, Karps, I fought one sword and boarder. I don't need to know how to fight another one, right? What's the difference? They're all just guys with a sword. Oh, I'm sorry. As a note, it's kind of loud in here. So if you can't hear me, just let me know, okay? I fought one. I can beat them all. Well, guess what? With sword and shield comes tons of variations. These variations can range from the shield itself, the sword itself, whether or not they're using multiple swords, maybe as a down stick. It could be the player using them.
It could also be the stance.
Yes, stances change. Various postures are going to change the game. And what people often do is there are a myriad of things that they find successful. So you're going to find a lot of different. It's the loudest damn washing machine. 1 second.
Hi, Kuma.
Hello.
Welcome back, Karps.
Hello. Okay, so you're going to find a wide variation of these things, and a lot of people do the things they like. So people pick and choose. Now, regionally, if you're fighting at your local practice, you might find that a lot of people use the same stuff. It's typically because when you're a new person, or even when you're a vetted fighter, and you see something that's working for somebody, you're likely to go, "Hey, what's that?" Ask the person, and that they'll sway you that way. It's often that the meta will change based by the region. So one area might have a lot of people who are using round punch shields and real long ultralight swords. But then you'll find another region where people are using flat blades and heater shields, right? So that's one thing that's going to kind of create a culture of a certain weapon type, which might mean that you fighting in a specific area might mean that you become better at fighting this specific weapon type than somebody from a different area. But you will potentially have trouble fighting a weapon type or weapon setup from another area. Does that make sense? This varies by region, and it's a very common thing, and you'll see it a lot, and especially throughout time. You'll notice. I know you're kind of newer, but for those of you who've been fighting a long time or have just been in the game for a long time, I'm sure you've seen a bunch of different weapon types go and become popular and then become less popular throughout the years. And that's because, and this is pretty much the key point of this, there are advantages and disadvantages to using certain weapon types. And they counter each other. It'll just be a wave of a meta that'll typically happen over time, where if a lot of people are using this thing that blocks this, this will stop being used, and whatever beats this will start being used. Does that make sense? You'll see this actually in I didn't mention this for sure. Okay, first let's go over some examples without getting too crazy into it. But variations are the key to understand here, and there's various advantages and disadvantages to different things. I'm going to give some examples of what those things are. So if they're weapons, the common variations of them are going to be the weapon length, the weight of the weapon, and the type of the sword. And the type will typically be flat blade or omnidirectional. That's later in the class, but those are examples. For shield, you're going to find various shield sizes, they get bigger. And there's reasons why that happens. It's actually fascinating, I think. And then strapping, whether it be like something that's strapped to your arm. I've got a bunch of shields in here. I'll give physical examples when we get to it. And then the core itself, whether this is a shield that is coreless or maybe one that has a piece of plywood that makes it sturdy and stronger. These are typically that'll end up affecting the weight of the shield itself too. And there's things that will align with each other, and we'll get into that. And even the opponent itself is something that will come with a wide amount of variations. One of and we're not going to get too much into the opponent itself here. That'll basically be 102 of this course. But common examples are opponent's size, whether that be their height, or their general size as far as like weight even will affect how you approach this fight. It'll also affect typically what loadout they're using. And that's something, if you can send me a PM, we won't get into it now, but if you want what will work for me naturally, or not me, but you or me, what would work for me naturally as far as shield types? Because what if you're like, oh, all my friends are using this, but I'm not being effective as they are? Well, if you're not the same size, maybe not the same shape, and you might not have the same athletic ability, these might be things that are not adding up the same way they are for your friends. That doesn't mean don't use them, as we prefaced at the beginning. If you're having fun, you're having fun. And the last thing I'm going to talk about with opponents, just briefly, is predicted ability. There is a way where you can look at somebody on the field if you've never fought them before and make a guess on how long that they've been fighting and how good they are at fighting. I'm sure this is something that you guys experienced. Your vets kind of look similarly, or they might have nicer garb. They might have shields and weapons that have been through it. There's plenty of them. And we're not going to get in today, but those are basic examples of how your opponent's variations can affect. Yes?
To be honest, the biggest tell for that has always been the veterans know each other.
You know what? And that's something that actually aligns with a lot of like inclusivity discussions about realms and stuff and how we can make newer people feel welcome as well. But that is true. If you go to a practice and you see a guy who's talking with everyone else, he likely knows everybody, has been in there, and it takes time to get to know everybody. That's a wonderful observation. And yeah.
It's actually really useful because if you find the one guy who knows everyone, a lot of times you could walk up to him and be like, hey, who can I ask about XYZ? And he'll point you to the best resource.
And that's philosophy that I agree. I'm a big fan of asking people things that I don't know. It never hurts to ask. And people like that, your vets that you can see, that eyeball is a good way to find those people. So do you have any questions about basic variations of things?
Like, they're more specific, so I'll wait.
Yeah, so we're going to cover it after I talk about the core philosophy of this class, and then once we get into those specific weapon types, I'm sure I'll answer a lot of those basic type questions. So we're going to talk about the core philosophy of this. This is a philosophy. This is just a take. Like I said it before, there's not a right way of doing things, but I'm telling you how I learn things and how they've basically made me the fighter I am today. Not the best, but definitely fighting. You know what I mean? The thing is philosophies aren't always 100% correct, and they work for the people who they speak to. So take this with as much you want to take it with. I'm not saying I'm right, but I'm saying this could be pretty effective for you as well. And this philosophy is a pretty simple one. It's called rock, paper, scissors. Is everybody on our class aware of what rock, paper, scissors is? I'm sure. And the thing is rock, paper, scissors is a game that anybody can play, but it breaks down wonderfully for combat-based games. I have, okay, so yeah, the common philosophy of rock, paper, scissors, for those of you at home, is that rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper, and paper beats rock. Everybody 100% on that one? Well, I'm going to talk about that. And I know it sounds kind of stupid, maybe, real too simple, but it really is we'll break it down. So it's a common philosophy in that it is in a lot of places. I'm going to give some examples of where you'll find similar philosophies to this. Is my favorite philosophy, and probably where I took this from, was Pokemon. You know what Pokemon is? So Pokemon's got a really simple rock, paper, scissors philosophy, and that's that water beats fire, fire beats grass, grass beats water. But it's expanded in that game. A lot of like RPGs will take a combat triangle. For those of you who don't know what combat triangle is typically something like magic beats melee beats range beats magic. That's a
Fire Emblem's a perfect example.
Yeah. And yeah, that works with fantasy trope as well. Hello. Yeah, so there's also a common thing, we're not going to get into it, it's called the beggar, the liar, and the thief, or there's variations, it's like the beggar, the thief, and the cheat. But that's something that you'll find in like boxing even. Just common philosophies of rock, paper, scissors scenarios that effectively communicate well in a combat scenario. But like I said before, it's more advanced than just the three. There's never really a true rock, paper, scissors scenario. It's likely going to be heavily expanded, and in Belagarth and weapon types, it does typically be it's pretty expanded. Where was I going to go with that? So the thing is it works on basic like pluses and minuses and advantages and disadvantages. A common trope you'll see is like someone who's shorter and smaller or weighs less might be sneakier or able to like, skate around the person who's much taller or heavier or basically it plays off of what people's strengths are. There's typically a weakness because of their strength. I see common tropes in Dungeons and Dragons, like the barbarian's got higher strength, but maybe he's not as smart or charismatic, or the wizard is really frail and he has low constitution, but
the laundry needs to be messed with.
Yeah, the wizard has like low constitution and he's not able to do this. Basically, that's the philosophy, is that with whatever advantage that you get, you'd probably get a disadvantage somewhere. And that is super true for sword fighting. But today what we're going to go over, because the thing is you can't just walk up and people are wearing a t-shirt that says scissors and you're like, oh, well, I know what to do. I know what to throw a rock at that, right? That's not really the thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to teach you guys how to see your opponent is scissors and how to pick rock. Does that make sense? That's the key thing here, is you don't know if your opponent is scissors or not. And how would you know to pick rock if you don't know what rock is? And I want you to have the ability to, instead of just always using one of these things, typically the thing, yeah, I'll get into that really quick. But I want you guys to be able to select the right or whatever is the better option when faced with a specific type. Does that make sense? Yeah. Do you have any questions at that philosophy?
This is hearkening back to the beggar, liar, and thief thing. Are you going to break down what that is? Because I think I know what that is, but
I'll give it to you really short.
Beggar throws lots of shots. Liar throws lots of feints. Cheat basically retaliates. Like if you throw it, well, you throw a shot, it's a bad shot. They're just going to cheat out your arm because they have a chance to. And beggar tends to beat liar. Liar tends to beat cheat. Cheat tends to beat beggar.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah,
okay, I wanted to make sure I remember. I think you told me that. That's why I was asking. It was either you or Hobbit.
Yeah, that's a common philosophy. It's pretty neat. And I'm going to talk about it really quick about how that's not always the case. So, Karps, why isn't my rock beating that scissors? Well, the thing is your rock might be under-leveled, or their scissors might be over-leveled, or higher level, basically. Sometimes you'll throw out your rock, and this is true in Pokemon, you'll throw out your rock type, and their scissors type is just such a high level that it crushes your rock. Why did that happen? What do I do to fix that? Well, you got to level up your rock. The thing is try to think of your shots as something that can be improved on individually. Try to think of your shots as something that can be improved on individually. If you practice, if you just throw something, and this should be true, hopefully this resonates with people. If you throw something and it didn't work, that doesn't mean that the shot is bad. It means that you need to improve, or you need to find a better situation in which that will be more effective. There's no bad shots unless you're hitting yourself with them. The fact that you threw them meant that they did something. And just because you throw something, it doesn't work, doesn't mean you should never throw it again. This is going to come with time and experience. But the truth of the matter is, sometimes if you're in a very highly competitive scenario, rock's not the best option against scissors. Sometimes your real good paper is going to take advantage and it's going to beat scissors. Which I know it is the opposite of what rock, paper, scissors are. But this is why it's an advanced rock, paper, scissors scenario. And here's, I actually put in my notes that some people have scissors made of lasers. They just throw lightsabers cutting through things. And that's the thing to understand, is your rock is going to get a boost by having the correct scenario advantage. But it's not always going to win just because it theoretically is better, right? Skill is typically what's going to trump the actual shot selection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a good example of this is when I first walked on the field, I threw bunches of shots, and Torn probably, was just able to sit there and still feint me and then just light into my ribs like nothing, because I had no idea what I was doing, and he's been doing it for probably 10 years at least.
Yeah, so the thing is, what you did with your shots, they weren't wrong. They just weren't fine-tuned. And that's part of what we're getting into here is the thing about it is if you have a high-level paper, you don't just have to always use paper all the time. You're going to find yourself in a situation where you're going to meet an equally high-leveled scissors and they're going to cut right through you. That's the philosophy here. So you got to get a pretty high level. I still struggle with learning my range sometimes. Yeah, we're going to get into range, especially when we talk about weapon lengths, especially. Oh, Kuma message in the chat for those who can't see. I still struggle with learning my range sometimes. That's certainly true. And we're going to cover range in weapon length when we get into that. So here's the thing. People do typically, commonly, not all the time, but people will often do what they are good at. If they find that something has been successful, that's what they'll throw. Typically, you'll find people will have bread and butter shots or bread and butter styles or how they fight. And when you fight them, they'll almost always be doing that. So what we want, and this is a common thing, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing, because if that's how you want to fight and if it is effective and working for you, it is right. However, if you can adapt and become a different version of yourself whenever you're fighting somebody, in a lot of scenarios, that's going to prove to be advantageous for you. If you can, instead of just building up in one area, I might be butchering this, but a quote that I often think of is, which is mightier, 100-story pillar, right? A 100-story pole or a 50-story temple, right? Which is the greater structure?
Another good metaphor is, I think it was Bruce Lee who said, "I fear not the man who has thrown one punch 10,000 times. I fear the man who has thrown 10,000 punches one time."
Yes, and that's a prime philosophy which we should be following, or at least making an attempt to. Being good at one thing is going to often be very successful for you in all the times in which that is successful. But being able to understand everything that's going on to your best of your ability and be able to put all your skill points in different skills are, in the long run, going to pay to your advantage. So is there any questions on it? It sounds like we're pretty much in consensus here, is try to be well-rounded, but people are if they're good at something, they will typically do that more often than other things. Yes.
I have what might be a more specific question. Is there any way other than just trial and error to be able to kind of figure out what style of shots and what style of fighter most likely fits your athleticism and body type quickly? Because I think I've found out mine, but I would love to hear your opinion.
Yeah. So trial and so the best way to practice sword fighting is by practicing sword fighting, and that's a given. If you find something doesn't work for you a lot and you don't want to level it up anymore, you don't want to work harder. Why work harder? That's kind of what the point of this is too, is why work harder on something when you can know the answer and apply what the better option is. So yeah, why even, you don't want to do trial and error. You want to just be able to skip to the pudding there. That's what you want. And yeah, we'll get over that when it comes to selecting our weapons and selecting it's kind of like making a build if you play like a MMO or something. What build best works for my class? And that's kind of like what our body types or our physicalities are going to be. They're going to be like our class, or maybe even our race, or if this is a video game that's the base on. And then we're going to adopt our kits based on what our thing is. It doesn't mean there's one right answer. There's always a new whatever. But there is a cheat sheet that'll typically work out better for you for your kit. And yeah, that's what we're getting at here, is our weapon type and our shield type and even our garb type, but won't get into that today, or whether or not we use armor, is going to base on a lot of our personal styles. And our kits are going to act accordingly in many ways. There's going to be examples of people who, and I'll give an example here. If you are shorter, and you'll see this commonplace, this isn't the letter of the law, but this is commonplace. If you are shorter, you will see a lot of people with higher shield place on their shoulders. So you'll see people who will use lower strap shields. And I'll show you an example right now. I've got an example right now. And again, we're not going to go over body types, but to answer your question a little bit, this, I'm shorter. I'm 5'8" or 9, at 9 on a good day. This is a low strap shield, which means I have a lot of coverage up on my shoulder when I want it. Does that make sense? At like a passive position, this. Do you have a clear picture of how much of my shoulder this protects?
Yeah, I really do.
You're good, Karps.
It's a lot of my shoulder is protected, right? Well, when I fight targets that are, or people that are much taller than I am, what they have access to is often my shoulders. So my kit is reflecting that by being able to take care of maybe a common threat to my body type. Does that make sense? Now, if we can guess here, the opposite of that, if you're tall, the more common thing that's going to be swung at than your shoulders is not the top of your body, but the bottom of your body. So you'll often see taller fighters using things like heaters that have angles at the bottom. I'll give an example of one of my favorites. Hopefully it's cool with me showing you guys. This shield is super neat because it's got a really real pointy bottom. And it's hard to get in the video here, but it actually protects a very large portion of my legs. And I can get this, let's see if I can get this. I can get this like all the way down to my feet pretty quickly. Does that make sense? And this is something that might benefit somebody who's taller. Again, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to automatically win, but you'll see a lot of tall people compensate by having shields that protect their legs. Now, there's advantages to that, and I'll get it when we do like an actual breakdown of these things. But before we do that, I'd like to talk about becoming aware. So the thing is if you have advantages or disadvantages, most of the time disadvantages, you become aware of them pretty quickly. Oh man, this side of my body is getting hit hella, right? Well, when you use a specific weapon type and you find out the disadvantage through trial and error, or if you're aware of the disadvantage right out the gate, now you'll know to block there more often, right? So the thing is if you're aware of the opponent's disadvantage, they're often also aware of their disadvantage. So there's definitely ways by like feinting or baiting them out or using like movements to exploit their weaker areas. But you'll see often where people might have their kits defend point A, and if point B is weak, they'll have their actions defend point B. Does that make sense? So that's where it kind of gets a little bit more difficult. But it's still good to understand what the advantages are of somebody else's kit. Because that's one thing. If you have a kit that is passively defending a certain area, that means you or your opponent has to actively defend this other area that's weaker, right? And it's much easier to get them to slip up on the thing that they have to actively defend than it is for them to slip up on the thing that they're passively defending. Does that make sense? Along that note, it's also easy to catch people being complacent about things that they don't have to worry about. Sometimes when I will use that heater shield or that one with the big wing on the shoulder or even my round shield, I'll think I'm perfectly comfortable or fine having that area defended like no one's going to touch me. And then if somebody actually targets that area and maybe does like a very dramatic feint or tries to catch me slipping and putting too much trust in that this is just going to never be a target area, then you can take advantage of that. So that's always something to be aware of is, are they being complacent with their advantages? So does that make sense? About being complacent about their advantages as well as them actively protecting something that they're aware is a disadvantage? Nice. Okay, that's good. Anyone on the chat have any questions about that in any way? Okay, so let's move on to the next topic. Now we're going to talk about examples. This is going to be the last probably the last 20 minutes of the class. If you guys have any questions, or if you can't see me in the frame, I'm gonna change the orientation of this. That didn't really work. Okay, we'll just say it like this. But I'm gonna give some examples. I have a garage full of weapons and stuff, so I'm gonna show you and talk to you about the advantages and disadvantages of certain things. The first thing that we're gonna start off with is weapons. Now, we're talking sword and board, so let's talk about things that you'll commonly see a sword and boarder do. The sword and boarder are typically gonna use a two-handed weapon. No, we classify them as a red. So we're gonna be talking about single swords that people can actively use with their one hand with a shield. And we're gonna talk about length first. I'm gonna give you an example of a short sword, and I'm gonna give you an example of a long sword really quick. I laugh because the long sword's ridiculously long. This is my long sword, and this is my short sword. It's short, it's a little stubby sword. Why would I want to use this? And why would I want to use this? This, by the way, is an extreme. And if this was much smaller, this would be an extreme. We're often going to find things kind of in the middle. Does that make sense? Yeah, a lot of times you're going to see people, typically a sword anywhere from 28 inches to 38 inches, depending on their build, their body type. A good rule of thumb is to be able to swing it and not hit the ground. If you can hit the ground, it's typically maybe a little too long for you, but depending on what you're using it for, it could be an advantage. And what that is range. Range is the big thing here with weapon length. If you're using a short weapon, you're going to have a more difficult time hitting an opponent from far away. You'll have to be closer to them. And if you have a longer weapon, you're going to have less of an issue hitting somebody from farther away, but you're going to have less control when they get closer range. And this is a very commonplace for those of you who have fought red fighting before. If you're a redsman and somebody gets right in your bubble, it's going to be harder to fight them. Same principle. If I have this real super long boy, this is a 47-inch sword. If somebody gets right in my A range, and we didn't talk about zones, but let's say close up. Yeah, rush that pole. Kuma says in the chat, rush that pole. The same thing. If you have a really long sword and you can get in a range where they stop being effective or their bubble, you're going to be able to take advantage of the long weapon. Now, what is a long sword to me versus a long sword to somebody who's 6 foot, maybe 6.5 feet tall? Just because they have a long sword doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be less effective with it at that point. If your body in relation to your weapon, if you're taller, you're going to likely use a longer sword. Or if you're physically stronger or larger, you're going to end up using maybe a larger weapon. That's not, again, that's just commonplace. That's not the end all. But this is a quick way to be able to identify your opponent.
Small question really quickly, because this is probably a basic. Could you
Sure.
give a breakdown on why a taller person would be using a longer sword on average? Because I've never actually been told that.
So it has to do with your weapon as well to your body. I think a general rule of thumb personally is if you can hold your sword, I'm gonna grab a normal sword that I would normally use. If you can hold your sword in a like a normal way. So if, let's say you're on like a normal grip here. Maybe you're not pommeling up and you're not choking up. You're just kind of like center grip how you would normally fight. If you can swing it and not touch the ground or barely touch the ground, this is an example. You guys can see I'm not touching the ground. This is a commonplace way. You have a lot of control over the weapon itself. As far as balance goes, in proportion to your body. The sword point will typically be about where your shoulder is. So it's not getting in the way of your shield itself. And this is just based on typical body proportions. If you're taller, you're able to use larger things without them getting in your way. Does that make sense? Or if you're physically strong.
So it's like you get the advantage without the negatives. So it's more of a, if you can use a longer weapon, a lot of times you want to because there's advantages to it.
Yeah, but then there's a point where it stops being an advantage and then it starts getting in your way. Or it's so short that it becomes generally, being tall is a very large advantage in combat sports. Generally, that in sword fighting, it's not necessarily any different. There's a lot of the very talented sword fighters tend to be taller or lankier. That doesn't mean that that's just going to be the end all. There's some fantastic short sword fighters, and there's some fantastic heavier set sword fighters, and that's not me trying to body shame in any way. We're just talking about body proportions in relation to kits. Does that answer a little bit of your question? You know what's a kind of an example of this? You know the sword that Frodo uses in the Lord of the Rings? That's a dagger. That's not a sword. But for Frodo, it's a sword. Does that make sense? Proportionally, someone who's very large using a sword would maybe be a dagger. Does that make sense? Kind of as a breakdown, a very simple example.
Yeah, that does make sense.
There you go. So that answers your question. I'm going to move on to the next thing I have on my list. I think we're still talking about length. As a note for weapon length, this isn't something that specifically pertains to the kit, but as a note for range control, especially because Kuma meant it in the chat here. When you're fighting somebody who is a taller opponent or somebody who's using a longer range weapon, it is important to remember that you have to make an attempt to control the range of the fight. That's a class in all itself. But if you're fighting somebody that can hit you from a range that you can't hit them, then you have to change things. You know what I mean? Because then they'll get free swings at you. And that's an example of where a very long weapon like this one would be really cool. Because if I'm fighting in a line fight and I don't have to worry about people hitting me, but I have free range on people's shoulders, that becomes a reason why I should be able to use this. An example of them not being able to control range. In that case, because of the line. But in some cases, it could just be on a one-on-one, somebody being able to backstep quicker than you can step forward. But that's something to be aware of when you look at somebody's weapon type and their length and their range to be able to take advantage of, or at very least get in a situation where you can also hit them at the same rate that they can hit you. We're going to move on to the next part about weapons because we're running a little shorter on time, maybe. Okay, we're going to talk about weapon weight. So there's typically a debate, and this will happen regionally, about heavier swords versus lighter swords. This will also happen based on the time that you've played the game. Access to different technologies in our games has paved the way for us to be able to do new things with weapons. A while ago, swords might commonplace have been maybe 15, 16 ounces. And now a lot of times in Southern California, you'll see every bat on the field will tend to be right on the money, 12 ounces or 12.1 ounces. And it won't be able to go any lighter because those are the rules. That doesn't mean it's a better sword. And that's a lot of times people will take that stance of, I want to use an ultralight weapon. Well, it's the weapon that works for you is going to be kind of more effective. But there is something to be said about the weight of a sword. Now, what is the advantage of using a lighter sword versus a heavier sword? Well, a lighter sword will be potentially easier to control and easier to get back into your guard position for the average person. If it's lighter, it's easier to manipulate. And I say lighter, I also mean balanced well. And we're going to kind of briefly talk about balance, but let's say it's balanced in a point in which you can balance it about in the middle of the weapon. If it's a lighter sword, it's going to be able to be potentially quicker. That's kind of the cheat there. It's quicker potentially on the average person. If you're using a heavier weapon based on who you are, how strong you are, how large you are, though the weapon might be more sluggish and might not be able to return to guard quicker. You might not be able to successfully throw as many shots as if you were to throw with a lighter weapon. That being said, there is certainly an advantage to having a heavier sword. If I have a heavier sword versus a lighter sword, I am going to be more easily able to manipulate swords. The faster train crashing on a slower train, you're going to be, if you have more momentum and typically more mass, if you come in contact with something that is lighter or has less momentum, the more momentum, more mass thing is likely going to win with the scenario. And that happens a lot with manipulation of weapons. or manipulation of shields. I'm a big fan of blowing through the shield and hitting the shoulder. That's one of my favorite things to do. And that happens because my weapon will typically be heavy enough, or my shot will be forceful enough to be able to get through that. Your shots become more forceful typically if they are heavier and you are able to fully swing them. Does that make sense? Also, a heavier sword is going to typically be able to not move. It's going to stop the shots. More common than if you have a lighter sword. If you got more weight in your hand, it will be stronger against strikes. So that is an advantage to using a heavier weapon. And kind of what we're talking about before, I wish I was, a 6.5 foot tall dude that was, got some weight on him, because it opens up some door. And I'm not saying this means that they're automatically better, but it opens up some doors to being able to use larger swords and naturally being able to have the strength to use them as if they were lighter. Does that make sense? That still, I know people who are large people who will still prefer hilt, like handle balanced swords that are super light, and they find that they end up being lighter for them. But as a general note, if you can use a heavier sword and you find it's effective for you, then it's going to provide some good advantages. Is there any questions about sword weight?
Yeah, does there tend to be an upper limit where it's like, don't have a sword this heavy, it's dumb?
Yes. That limit is when it starts to hurt your opponents. That can be about padding. It could be about, that's the thing too, is if you're creating more force, it creates, the need becomes more foam or protection in order to stop the core. So if you're using something that's fiberglass and you're swinging real hard with it and you're hitting 17 ounces on your sword, it's going to be harder for you to be able to protect your opponent, which is also, someone you don't want to hurt physically. Keep them protected. So yes, there is a limit, and that's the one that you decide that keeps your opponent safe and creates the least amount of padding for your sword. If you have to use something that's super heavy, but your sword ends up being, super girthy because of it, you're going to actually create some disadvantages for you. Does that make sense? We'll actually kind of get into that in the next part of this. And that is flat versus omnidirectional. I personally don't want to have this talk with people because it ends up being a debate. There isn't a right answer on this. These are preferences. But I'm going to talk briefly about advantages each one has. I personally use an omnidirectional sword. That means the sword can be struck. I can strike at any part of it and it'd be a legal strike. A flat blade will typically be called a flat blade. It doesn't mean it's perfectly flat, but it's flattened on one side. Does that make sense? This side is non-striking surface, and this is striking surface. Now, it's an age-old debate on which is the better thing. There isn't an answer, but there are reasons why you would use one of them. The main part about this is going to be profile, and this is why we talk about using a bunch of foam. Is a flat-bladed sword will often be it'll have a lower surface area than an omnidirectional sword will have. Does that make sense? And you might be able to get tighter shots in areas that you might not be able to get with an omnidirectional sword with a flat blade. Does that make sense? That is not the letter of the law. And the reason why I say it's not the letter of the law is because I have seen plenty of flat blades that are super, super thin and super, super thick. I've seen plenty of omnidirectional weapons that are super, super thick. I've even seen ones that are very thin. We have a rule in our game that swords need to not be able to pass 1/2 inch through a 2.5 inch hole, which means that the tip has to be basically 2.5 inches large, at least. But that doesn't, in Bellegarth, mean that the blade itself has to do that. It's a weird rule. We'll talk about it later. But swords are not necessarily, they don't apply in that same rule. They don't have to be 2.5 inches in circumference. And I'll link the exact rules on that. But it tends to mean because of our rules, swords will typically be of a narrower surface area than omnidirectional swords. And that is one of the advantages of using a sword. The advantage of using an omnidirectional sword is I can hit you with any part of this thing, which means a lot of shots that might not be available to land, because if I threw them with a flat, I might hit them with the flat part. I don't have to worry about when I throw using an omnidirectional sword. When your opponent is using an omnidirectional sword, it might mean that they're going to throw shots that are going to potentially be well, there's a term we use, we call them half wraps. And half wraps can be done in a reverse or a just a flat wrap variant. I will give an example of that shot. It is a shot that's very easy to show on a flat sword. It's if you're striking and you hit them with the flat portion of the weapon. If it's a reverse, it's when you're striking and you hit them with the flat part of the weapon. With an omnidirectional sword, you can throw both of those shots without having to worry about hitting them with the flat part of the weapon. That is a large advantage of using an omnidirectional sword. And when you see your opponent using an omnidirectional sword, understand that that is a shot that is now part of their repertoire, potentially. Does that make sense? Yes?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Okay. When it comes to blocking, there's also an advantage to using a flat that, as I think, is negligible. It's not very big of a deal. But if I'm using an omnidirectional sword, because of it being round, if somebody strikes me, and it's very hard to do this by myself, but if someone strikes me with it, my sword isn't being stopped by any of the foam. Does that make sense? It's actually just completely able to be around here. And if I'm using a flat, let's see this. If I'm using a flat and I do this, the flat of, because of my sword is angular, it doesn't have the same way to more easily go around the weapon. I think that that's not that big of a deal. It doesn't happen very often, at least not in the current meta of our area, that's not really a big deal. But those are the advantages and disadvantages of using a flat blade, and understanding that your opponent has those advantages and disadvantages could mean, the survival of you in the fight. So that's it for weapons that we're going to talk about today. Our last topic is going to be on shields. Does anybody have any questions about weapons, the swords?
Not particularly.
Cool. Okay. So the shields are my favorite part. I think it's the easiest thing to identify. Oh, actually, wait. I'm sorry. Before we move on, I want to talk to you about how to identify whether or not a sword is long. You can see if it's long or short. But how do you identify if a sword is, and same thing with omnidirectional or flat, you can tell. But you can't really tell if a weapon is heavier or not, right? How would I be able to do that? If it's larger, it is likely going to be heavier than if it's smaller. That's just mass generally. If your opponent is much larger and maybe a real strong woman or man or other,
Steel.
yes. Well, actually, steel uses light bats, but that's
No, but I mean, he's strong
large.
as heck.
But yeah, if we were to look at people, we can make an assumption that they're taking advantage of their size by being able to use something that is heavier more comfortably. So that's one way we can gauge. My favorite way to figure out if somebody's sword is heavy or light is I ask them. If I can see their sword. There's nothing that says in the book that I can't ask somebody to see their equipment. Most of the time, if you're just actually admiring something, and that's something that I do often, is I'll check out people's new equipment because I find it fascinating, and I also want to know what they're using and what I'm up against. That might be, it's not cheating, but it might be considered to some cheating by looking at your opponent's kit. You don't always have that luxury, but when you do, utilize your luxury of being able to figure out what your buddies are using. And that goes for everything here. If you don't know about their shield, grab it, or not, of course, with consent. Get more information from the people that you're fighting, potentially. All right, let's talk about shields. This is the last portion of the course. It's one of my favorite parts of it, and it is awesome because there's so many variations. But we'll talk about a couple. The first thing that we need to talk about, though, when we talk about shields, is this thing called static or passive guard. So what that means is typically the larger, heavier strap shields, and this is like a combination of the most passive defense that you can have. Large, heavy strap is going to be the hardest to manipulate and the easiest to just let do all the work for you. That's not a bad thing, because if you're using something that's heavy, it doesn't move, like we covered in the weapon thing, it doesn't move as easily, so it's not as easy for the opponent to manipulate. If you're using something that's large, it's larger and therefore covers more area. And if you're using a strap, it is strapped to your arm and less capable of either you or your opponent actively moving it around or manipulating it. So that's an example of the most passive setup you can have is the largest shield that you want. So why wouldn't everybody just use the largest shield that they possibly could, the heaviest, largest shield? Well, some people used to do that in the past. Some people still do it. Not in our area very often now. But the thing is if you have static guard, you are actively doing less. And if you are not actively doing stuff, it means that you have less room to bait your opponent. If I have covered the entirety of my body, then my opponent doesn't have a lead on what to do. So what are they going to do? I can't tell what my opponent's going to do because my opponent doesn't have any room to guess where they're going to do. Does that make sense? It could end up being a guessing game. At that point, you have less information about your opponent. That's not a good, in my opinion, in most people's opinion, if you have less information about your opponent, it's a bad thing. So that's part of it, is you want to be able to tell your opponent where that they should swing so you can take advantage of it. And that's where we get to the extreme active lack of passive defense. What if we used something that was super light, punch, and didn't have, and was super small? Do I have an example? I don't have. Let's pretend I do have. Well, I had one. I don't have one now. But a little tiny minimum shield is kind of the most the least passive defense you can have. Why would somebody do that if they're not passively defending? Well, if I have a shield that's that small, my opponent can swing in lots of places in my body. Does that make sense? And I'm kind of in control. So if I put my shield up here, my opponent's less likely to swing at my shield than they are the parts that it's not protecting, right? So in that sense, I've actually now created, if I do this, I know my opponent's going to swing over here. I know to take advantage of that. Does that make sense? So those are extremes. Most people don't deal in the extremes. Most people are somewhere in the middle. Let's talk from the top here. Let's talk about size. Your size should be, for the most part, to get the most utility, proportionate to your body. What does that mean, proportionate to your body? Everybody's bodies are different, and therefore, there's no perfect shield shape for your body. I find, as a general rule of thumb, if you are somebody who is roughly 5'8" to 5'10", a shield that is either strap or punch that is 28 to 30 inches in across is going to be the most, and round typically, is going to be some of the most versatile you can do. It's going to provide a lot of opportunity for your opponent to swing at you while still providing a lot of passive defense for you. That does not mean that that's the best shield to use. It's just kind of like the zero, the blank, not really an advantage, not really a disadvantage. This could also be said, I think it's passively if you're, and I've seen this commonplace, feel free to disagree with me, you guys at home. If it's a strap shield, you'll typically see something from a 26 to a 29 inches across round as a staple. And if it's a punch shield, you'll see something anywhere from 22 to 26 tops inches round. And that's going to be real common base stat zeros. Not really a huge advantage anywhere, not really a huge disadvantage anywhere. Size proportionate to your body is going to change. So, for example, I personally fit kind of an average for a male. I'm, about 200, maybe a little bit higher than average as far as weight wise, but I'm about 200 pounds, 5'8", 5'9". That's average. I use a 28 and it fits my body well. That's going to be partly trial and error, but also partly understanding how the shield's going to protect you. If you're looking to get a shield in that size, I recommend finding somebody who's similar body type than you, and comparing what their equipment is so it would work for you. That's the cheapest way to do it. or you can make mock-ups using cardboard and see how it lays on your body. That being said, if you're smaller or larger, you want to accommodate. If you're smaller, a smaller shield will protect more of your body without getting in the way of your shots. And if you're larger, a larger shield will protect maybe the same amount of somebody who is smaller than you. That's a general on sizes and static and passive guard. Any questions on that? No, it's pretty. I think it's pretty simple as far as your passive and static and managing what the advantages and disadvantages are. Especially when we're talking about real simple shapes like the circle. We're going to talk now about strapping. I have two examples of strapping that I'm going to show you guys. This is a punch shield. Oh, sorry. Before we move on to this, as far as passive or static defense for your opponent, if you reckon, because we're talking about how we fight these things, not just how we understand what their bonuses are. If you're fighting somebody with a larger shield than is proportionate to their body, you can use it against them by putting yourself in areas that their shield is unable to basically make their shield work against them.
Are you referring to kind of almost using their shield as a shield for you?
Yes. To a degree, or if you're getting them in a position where they can't swing at you. So if, for example,
that's what I meant. Like, they can't swing at you because their shield's in the way, so it's almost shielding you.
Yeah, I have this awesome, oh, it's super buried. I have this shield that is humongous. But let's say I was using a shield that was much larger than me, and I'm fighting you. I have to fight around my shield. Also, if you're a fighter who will put their shield in front of their face, you're working against yourself because you're not protecting an area that is actually defending you. That's another thing. But yeah, if your shield is much larger than you, then effectively you as your opponent can get into a portion that's furthest away from the sword, or that the shield is no longer working for them. And that's something that's going to take a little bit of trial and error. There's so many variations of shields that it'd be hard to say, give like a specific example. But if you see it, take advantage of it. The opposite is true when you're using a small shield. A good way to take advantage of a small shield is by fainting them. Yeah, we'll get back to it. But fainting a small shield is super effective because if they have less passive defense, they have to worry about the shots that you throw. Does that make sense? If I got a little tiny punch shield and you throw something real high to my shoulder, if I don't block that or get out of the way, it's going to hit me in my shoulder. But when I block it on my shoulder, what's open everywhere else, right? If it's a real small shield. And that's kind of the truth about sizes there when it comes to feinting. The smaller the shield, the more likely the opponent is going to have to actually respond to your feints, or they will die. And that means that you can feint them out and then hit them somewhere else. Does that make sense for small shields? This will also be especially true for any type shield that has less static or passive defense. The more they have to be active, the more they have to respond, which means feints will be more effective. And then actually, I'm going to go back in time real quick when we talk about larger shields. If they are protected almost wholly, the best way to get them out of their shell or their fortress is by baiting them out of it. Does that make sense? If they're sitting behind a big shield and you don't know what to do, get them to lower their shield to be able to swing at you. Because then when they're going to be able to stop using their defenses, they're going to open up things. Which means if somebody's using a big shield, they might not swing as much. They might wait for you to swing or get in a position where they can take advantage of you. Or you bait or you leave something open. Like if those of you at home are unfamiliar with baiting is if you were like, just leave your arm out or leave your shoulder so they think that they're going to hit you. And then you block and then take advantage of what they opened up because of your bait. And that's going to work on shields that have higher static or passive defense. Use baits, and then less use feints. That's the rundown of that. Let's talk. Does that make sense? All right, let's talk about strapping really quick. Strapping, super simple. I have two examples. I actually like to use both for different things. I've been really digging the low strap here. Strapping, if you're using a strap shield, my shield cannot be as far away from my body as if I were using a punch shield. If I use a punch shield, I can put my shield way over here. Does that make sense? So that's an advantage and a disadvantage because I'm actually creating more static guard when my shield can't be moved away from me. If somebody feints me, my shield can't go all the way over there. Does that make sense? So my body actually is, or my strapping is actually stopping me from being able to cover certain areas, potentially. But it also means that I'm not easily tricked out by feints naturally. Punch shields, and this is one of those ones where you might want to bait a strap shield and you might want to feint a punch shield because a punch shield means that I have less passive defense, potentially, because my opponent can get my shield further away from my body and therefore my shield's not protecting me as much anymore. That also means that, my punch shield is able to get further on my body. I'm able to protect my whole, pretty much anywhere I put my punch shield, which is an advantage of a punch shield, is that it might have more opportunity to be able to cover anywhere that you want it to, instead of you having it just literally strapped to your arm. That might be something you want to feint because of their ability to move the shield. Does that make sense? It's kind of like playing on their advantages versus their disadvantages. Their strength can be their weakness if you are aware of it. Another advantage to using a strap shield is that it is less easily manipulated. And I don't have a buddy here, and it's also better at manipulating potentially. I don't have a buddy here, but if I did, I would show you. If I have this strapped to my arm, it is very strong. It doesn't move. So if I were to want to manipulate somebody's shield, I can push them away or grab or hook. And this is strapped to my arm, and therefore I have more control of this shield because it's on my arm. It's part of my body, and my body can create a lot of momentum and force, and I can be able to utilize that to my advantage. If I did that with a punch shield, I might be able to have wider range or maybe more articulation, but the shield itself is fairly flimsy. It can move around. My wrist, fun point, your wrists are very, very not strong. They're weak. Your wrist is one of your weakest parts of your body. So if you're using them for sword fighting, you should use other parts. There's other classes you can take about understanding that fully, but your wrist isn't as strong as your arm. It's kind of the general point here. So if you're using a punch shield, you have less, you can be moved around easier. That can often be seen by if somebody pushes a punch shield here, it'll move. Does that make sense? It's kind of harder to grip. There's a lot of control.
You're more likely to stab a punch shield than a strap shield.
Yeah, typically, yeah. Or you basically will have to get around the strap shield, whereas the punch shield, you'll be able to move around. And that is a weakness of punch shields. If you ever see someone with a punch shield and you're like, just know that you can manipulate them. So don't be afraid of being able to use their shield against them. Are there any questions as far as punch versus strap? Or yeah, punch versus strap.
You've made the differences pretty clear.
Yeah. There isn't really an in-between on punch versus strap. That's just kind of the two ways people strap shields. There are variations of where it's worn on your back or worn on your arm. That's not standard, and we won't talk about that today. Those are typically more standard for different weapon types like red or spear or archery. The last part we're going to talk about is the most fun part, shape. The shape of your shield will give you advantages and disadvantages. And my favorite, basically the paragons here are angled shields and rounded shields. And there's a really neat thing. I know I'm going to blow your mind right now, or you already know, and you're going to look at me like I'm done. Your body has angles and rounded parts. Yeah, it's crazy. If you break down the body, watch, like you got your neck, you got your traps and your shoulders, and you have your arm, your biceps, your arms, and your elbows, and your wrists, or even your sides. There are a series of either angles or rounded parts. So your traps here, I think I'm getting that right. Your traps, part of your neck here, these are your rounded parts, right? They're a little more on the round side. And your shoulders here, your points here are points. Yeah, they're a little bit more on the angled side. Your arm here, you see that round bit right here? This is round, and my elbow is pointed, and my forearm here is rounded. Does that make sense? So yeah, stay with me here. Stay with me. And you're depending on how your weight or your general stature size, your up chest area right underneath your arm might be more rounded or flat. That's less important. I try to think of this as being kind of round or flat, depending on the body. It changes. Or your butt is round, or your hips are roundish. Anyway, the reason why this is important is because when we talk about shields that are round or angled, they actually help certain parts of your body that match them. So, and my shield, I love my shield. It's round and angled. But if I'm using my shield like this, right? You can't see right now, and typically you can't if you just walk up to somebody what's behind their shield. But, and hopefully you guys can see it at home. If you see now this rounded shape, what are the parts that are closest to the shield? The edge of it, the pointed parts. My elbow is approaching the end here. My upper point of my shoulder here is very close to this. And if you notice, the rounded shield is protecting the rounded parts better than they are the angled parts. And the angled shields, like a heater, if I were to do them in the same degree, they're actually protecting. In this point, the elbow is a little different depending on what you're using. If you're using a strap shield, which I don't have an example of a heater strap, but there's a point right here typically on a heater strap that will protect your elbow-ish. But the shoulder here will be typically protected by the point, and the part that is exposed is the rounded parts of your arm. Your body.
I have never noticed that before.
Yeah, so
I've literally never noticed that.
So this is a way you can kind of get an X-ray on somebody's shield. When you look at somebody's shield, you can look at the rest of their body and what is not being protected, as well as the parts that are being overprotected. Now, this is something that you can totally use to your advantage at all times. I like to throw shots that aren't going to hit my target area until the shield moves. So like body feints. So if I move my body and then throw a shot, I'm actually throwing a shot towards, if it was a round shield, maybe the elbow. Sorry, that's not my elbow. This is my elbow. Elbow also, but my shoulder area here, which is pointed, I can throw at it while being confident that once that shield moves, I'm able to see part of the exposed part of their body, and that shot can land through. It also could be true about somebody who's using maybe a heater shield on their bicep here, right here. Even though you can't see it, it might be so close to the edge of the shield here that if you throw it, it'll move the shield a little bit and you'll tag the arm. So when I want you guys to approach people who are using specific shield types, I want you to be able to look at it and go, oh, well, they're using a pointed shield. That means the likelihood that I hit the round bits is higher. So I should aim for the round bits, right? Yeah, so that's kind of the point of the rounded shield versus pointed shield debate there. Now, it does get a little trickier. I'm using right now a heater shield that is punch, which means it's not strapped to my arm and therefore is not stuck in one place. Instead, I have the ability to move this point where I want to. Does that make sense? Now, that is a more difficult concept. This is where we trade our paragon advantages and disadvantages for a blend of the two. That's something that you might have to trial and error a little bit more, or use shield manipulation based on your static or passive defense to take advantage of areas by baiting or feigning and understanding what parts of their body are most likely going to be able to be hit based on their shield shape. We'll also get into really quick ways that they can put a lot of points in one area of their body. For example, this winged shield that I had here a moment ago, it's got a lot of names. People call it a lot of different things. But it's like a winged heater, basically. So this is covering so much of my shoulder up here that there really isn't the round bit to hit. Does that make sense? And this is part where you would maybe look at different parts of the shield. Like in this example, where the hand is positioned, I have a lot less protection of this part of my body here than I do the rest of this part of the body. I have a lot less protection of my arm here because of the flat doesn't go with the round. Does that make sense? So I can aim for it. That's my question here. What's my question? If I were to approach you with this weapon type, I'm using a short sword and this heater, what would be a shot that you can throw at me? Or what target area would you like to hit?
Left bicep?
Left bicep is a great target area. What's another one that would be easier for you to hit?
Right hip?
Right hip, because it's less protected. I'm going to give you another example of this. If I'm using a longer sword and this little tiny shield, what is your approach to this situation? This is a round punch shield.
Probably feint left hip, try to throw toward, no, feint right hip, probably try to throw left shoulder.
Shoulder's good. Shoulder is really good. Now, what range are you going to be fighting me at?
Equal range, probably.
Equal. Your arms are real long. My arms aren't very long, right? So that really kind of like narrows the playing, well, equals the playing field a little bit, right? So we're kind of able to hit each other to the same degree at that point. I do like that. So you're going to feint me out, though, to be able to pull that away because it's a small punch, right? There you go. I think you pretty much have gotten it. Does that make sense as far as the whole breakdown goes? Now that you approach a fight, you can look at somebody and go, hey, this is what move I can use.
I hadn't actually considered shield shape and weaknesses based and advantages based on that. I just kind of thought shield mean this part blocked. Don't try to hit it because it blocked. So that's completely new to me.
You know what's a weird one here? Check it out. So let's say, forget about the sword, but I have this, right?
Yeah.
This has protected my shoulder. Remember when I talked about complacency with this?
Mm-hmm.
This is a punch shield, right? What's strong against a punch shield as far as shots wise? What can I do to get this shoulder?
Feints or really hard shots?
Yeah, so this is a coreless shield. So you would be applying the ability for this to be able to be manipulated. The same way, if it's a punch, it's easier manipulated than if I was using a cord strap shield. So yeah, if I just throw something real heavy, that might blow right through. If your sword, you think that's a benefit of it being heavier, right?
Doesn't that also kind of get into the stylistic difference of the ways you would fight a punch shield as a flow fighter versus a red fighter? Like a red fighter could 100% just, oh, that's a punch shield. That block doesn't matter right now because they're going to have to dedicate to that block if they actually want to block it. Versus as a flow fighter, there's a good chance they're going to be able to block it because I can't put as much force behind just one arm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a neat part about this is a lot of weapon types kind of blend into this philosophy as well. A lot of weapon types use shields as well. So this is something that you can also play into it. If you see somebody's got a spear and their back shield is two straight lines, right? You got their underarms, which are a little bit more rounded, or their shoulders at that point. Or yeah, if you're fighting a redsman and you see that their red is, longer for being a red. Now you can apply, how can I make their range not work for them anymore? Or as a redsman, I see this guy with the strap shield. Am I able to can I freaking rock this shield? Or is there a chance that my shots, even if they're swung at powerful shots, might not be sufficient? You know what I mean? And that opens up a lot of other cans of worms. But this is certainly something that could be applied to literally any variation of a sword or a shield. Yeah.
That is actually really interesting, and I might think more on that.
I really hope you do. I think that's pretty much it. If you have any final questions on the course, please let me know.
God, I had one, but I forgot it.
The cool thing is I'm absolutely available for sending like a private message, or even if you just wanted to have a video chat that you wanted something physically for me to show you. I'm totally available. Everyone for watching the course as well. This is a topic that I'm fascinated by, and I would love to either have a conversation about it. Tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me that or tell me that you liked it. Or if you have more questions, shoot me a PM. My name is Devin. It's right here. Devin Michael Wilson or Squire Karps. Send me a message. You think of a question?
Yes, I did. And this is probably not specific to this one. This is kind of maintaining your weapons while being able to practice alone because it's the plague. Do you have any
Pause real quick. I'm going to end the recording right now. I'll probably edit the last couple seconds out. But thank you guys for watching. Thank you for attending. And then, yeah. Okay, stop.